When Marcus laughed at 14-year-old Ethan's claim of self-teaching advanced mathematics, he had no idea this homeless kid would solve equations that stumped PhD professors, changing everything he believed about genius. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Community Center buzzed overhead as Dr. Marcus Hoffman adjusted his expensive watch and surveyed the dozen teenagers sitting in mismatched plastic chairs before him. At 45, Marcus had built his reputation as one of the city's most prestigious mathematics professors, teaching at elite institutions where students paid thousands for the privilege of learning from his brilliant mind. Today, however, he found himself in this humble community center, fulfilling a mandatory volunteer requirement that his university had imposed on all faculty members. Marcus couldn't hide his disdain as he looked around the cramped room with its peeling paint and outdated posters about college preparation. These weren't his usual students, the ones from wealthy families who came to class already equipped with private tutors and expensive calculators. These were kids from the wrong side of town, many of whom probably wouldn't even finish high school, let alone pursue higher education. "All right, let's get this over with," Marcus muttered under his breath, though loud enough for several students to hear. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of basic algebra worksheets that he'd hastily printed that morning. "I suppose we'll start with some elementary problems that might be appropriate for your level." The students shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Most avoided eye contact, having learned from experience that adults in positions of authority rarely had their best interests at heart. They'd heard that tone before, the one that immediately categorized them as less capable, less worthy of serious attention. But one student didn't look away. Ethan Martinez sat in the back corner, his threadbare backpack clutched tightly in his lap. At 14, he was smaller than most of his peers, with clothes that had clearly seen better days and shoes that had been repaired multiple times with duct tape. His dark hair needed cutting, and there was a weariness in his eyes that spoke of responsibilities no child should carry. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that Ethan Martinez was homeless. For the past 8 months, he'd been living in his older sister's beat-up car, moving from parking lot to parking lot, to avoid being discovered by authorities who would separate them and place them in different foster homes. While other kids his age were worried about video games and social media, Ethan spent his nights by streetlight, teaching himself mathematics from library books that he borrowed during the day. "Now then," Marcus continued with barely concealed condescension, "let's see if anyone can solve this simple equation." He wrote on the whiteboard, 3x plus 7 or 22. Several hands went up tentatively. Marcus called on a girl in the front row who nervously gave the correct answer. Lucky guess, he thought to himself, making no effort to acknowledge her success or build her confidence. "Let's try something slightly more challenging," Marcus said, writing another basic algebra problem. Again, several students provided correct answers, but Marcus remained dismissive, clearly convinced that these kids were simply stumbling through problems that any real student could solve, blindfolded. As the session continued, Marcus's attitude became increasingly patronizing. He spoke slowly, as if addressing children much younger than 14, and frequently made comments about how students from better schools would find these problems trivial. The room grew tense as the teenagers absorbed his implicit message that they were intellectually inferior. Ethan watched the entire display with growing anger. Not anger at being underestimated. He was used to that. But anger at watching his peers being systematically demoralized by an adult who was supposed to be helping them. These kids were smart, creative, resourceful. They deserved better than this academic arrogance. During a brief break, Marcus was chatting with the community center coordinator when she mentioned Ethan's unusual situation. "That boy in the back corner has been through so much," she said quietly. "Living in a car with his sister, but still comes to every educational program we offer. Says he's teaching himself advanced subjects." Marcus laughed out loud, the sound echoing harshly in the small room. "Advanced subjects? Let me guess. He thinks watching YouTube videos counts as real education." He shook his head dismissively. "These kids always think they know more than they do. It's actually quite sad how delusional they can be about their capabilities." The coordinator looked uncomfortable. "Actually, the librarians say he's been borrowing university-level textbooks. Calculus, linear algebra, even some theoretical mathematics that most college students don't touch until their junior year." "Please." Marcus scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. A homeless 14-year-old teaching himself university mathematics. That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week. These kids can barely handle basic arithmetic, and you're telling me one of them is self-studying calculus? What Marcus didn't realize was that Ethan had overheard every word. The boy's hands clenched into fists as he listened to this educated adult dismiss not just his efforts, but his very capacity for learning. For months, Ethan had been pushing himself through complex mathematical concepts because he believed education was his only way out of poverty. He'd spent countless nights working through problems by streetlight, using notebook paper he'd found in dumpsters behind office buildings. When the session resumed, Marcus decided to have some fun at Ethan's expense. "I understand we have a self-proclaimed mathematics genius in our midst," he announced with theatrical amusement. "Young man in the back, Ethan, is it? Why don't you come up here and show us all what self-teaching can accomplish?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Ethan, who remained seated for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. He could stay silent, endure the humiliation, and let this arrogant professor continue believing that poor kids were incapable of intellectual achievement. Or he could stand up and face whatever additional mockery was coming his way. "Come on," Marcus goaded, his smile cruel and confident. "Don't be shy. Show these other students what happens when someone thinks they can replace real education with wishful thinking." Slowly, deliberately, Ethan stood up. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "What would you like me to do, Professor?" Marcus's grin widened. This was going to be even more entertaining than he'd anticipated. "Oh, I think we should start with something appropriately challenging for someone of your self-proclaimed abilities." Without any real expectation that Ethan would succeed, Marcus walked to the whiteboard and wrote out a problem that typically appeared in second-year university calculus courses. It involved advanced integration techniques and theoretical concepts that even many college students struggled with. "There you go," Marcus said, stepping back with arms crossed. "Let's see what 8 months of self-teaching can accomplish against 4 years of undergraduate mathematics and a PhD in the subject." The other students looked between Ethan and the incomprehensible symbols on the whiteboard with growing anxiety. This wasn't going to end well for anyone. But Ethan Martinez walked to that whiteboard with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent countless nights pushing himself through exactly these types of problems. He picked up the marker, studied the equation for less than 30 seconds, and began to write. What happened next would change everything Marcus Hoffman thought he knew about intelligence, education, and the incredible potential hidden in the most unexpected places. The silence in the room was deafening as Ethan Martinez approached the whiteboard with steady, deliberate steps. Every student held their breath, knowing they were about to witness either a spectacular humiliation or something extraordinary. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, that cruel smile still playing on his lips, completely confident that this homeless teenager was about to embarrass himself in front of everyone. The calculus problem stared back at them from the whiteboard. A complex integration that involved partial fractions, trigonometric substitution, and advanced techniques that typically took university students months to master. It was the kind of problem that Marcus used to weed out weaker students in his advanced courses, designed to separate those with true mathematical understanding from those simply memorizing formulas. Ethan picked up the marker and studied the equation for what felt like an eternity, but was actually less than 30 seconds. The other students watched with growing anxiety, silently willing him to succeed but fearing the worst. They'd all experienced enough academic humiliation to know how this usually ended for kids like them. Then something remarkable happened. Ethan began to write, and every stroke of the marker was precise, confident, purposeful. He started by recognizing the structure of the integral, immediately identifying that it required a combination of techniques. Without hesitation, he decomposed the rational function using partial fractions, his handwriting neat and methodical, despite the pressure of having 15 pairs of eyes, watching his every move. Marcus's smile began to fade as he watched Ethan work. The boy wasn't guessing or stumbling through random steps. He was applying advanced mathematical techniques with the fluency of someone who truly understood the underlying concepts. But that was impossible. This was a homeless 14-year-old with no formal training in higher mathematics. This must be some kind of trick, Marcus thought to himself. Maybe he's seen this specific problem before. There's no way he actually understands what he's doing. But as Ethan continued, it became clear that this wasn't memorization or lucky guessing. When he reached the trigonometric substitution portion, he paused for just a moment to consider which substitution would be most elegant, then proceeded with the confidence of someone who had worked through dozens of similar problems. His mathematical reasoning was not just correct, it was sophisticated, choosing the most efficient path through a complex problem. The other students began to sit up straighter in their chairs. They didn't understand the mathematics being performed in front of them, but they could recognize competence when they saw it. This wasn't their usual experience of watching a peer struggle with material that seemed impossibly difficult. This was watching someone demonstrate mastery. Sarah, a 15-year-old who had been attending the community center programs for 2 years, whispered to her friend, "I had no idea Ethan was this smart. He never talks about himself." Indeed, that was part of what made this moment so shocking. Ethan had been attending various educational programs at the community center for months, but he always sat quietly in the back, never drawing attention to himself, never volunteering answers even to basic questions. The staff knew he was intelligent. His library borrowing records alone indicated an unusual level of academic curiosity, but none of them had suspected the true extent of his capabilities. As Ethan moved through the integration by parts section of the problem, Marcus felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, the recognition that he might be completely wrong about something fundamental. For decades, he had operated under the assumption that mathematical ability was largely a function of socioeconomic privilege. Good schools, private tutors, educated parents who could provide support and resources. But here was a homeless teenager, working without notes or references, solving a problem that challenged his university students. And he wasn't just getting the right answer. His method was elegant, his reasoning clear, his execution flawless. "Where did you learn this?" Marcus found himself asking, his voice much quieter than it had been moments before. Ethan didn't look up from his work, but answered matter-of-factly, "Library books, YouTube lectures from professors at top universities, online mathematics forums, where people discuss advanced problems." He continued writing as he spoke, never breaking his concentration. When you have 16 hours a day with nothing to do but learn, you can cover a lot of material. The simple honesty of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow.
While his privileged students were complaining about having to attend 2 hours of class per week, this boy had been spending the equivalent of a full-time job teaching himself advanced mathematics because it was literally all he had. Ethan reached the final integration step, evaluating the definite integral with the same confidence he'd shown throughout the entire solution.
When he set down the marker and stepped back, the whiteboard displayed a complete, correct, and beautifully organized solution to a problem that typically stumped second-year engineering students. The room erupted in spontaneous applause from the other teenagers, who recognized that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, even if they couldn't fully comprehend its academic significance. But Marcus stood frozen, staring at the whiteboard as if it contained some impossible mathematical proof that challenged the laws of physics. That's completely correct," Marcus stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just correct. It's one of the most elegant solutions I've seen to that particular problem." Ethan turned to face the professor, and for the first time, Marcus really looked at this kid. He saw the intelligence that had always been there, but also the weariness of someone who had been dismissed and underestimated his entire life. He saw the quiet dignity of someone who had survived circumstances that would have broken most adults. And he saw something else, a hunger for learning that was so pure and intense that it took his breath away. "Professor Hoffman," Ethan said quietly, "can I ask you something?" Marcus nodded, still too stunned to form coherent words. "Do you really believe that intelligence is determined by zip code? That curiosity and capability are somehow distributed based on family income? Or is it possible that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity doesn't?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but not an aggressive one. It was the gentle inquiry of someone who genuinely wanted to understand how an educated adult could hold such limiting beliefs about human potential. Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis. For the first time in his academic career, He was being intellectually challenged not by a peer or superior, but by a 14-year-old who had just demonstrated mathematical abilities that rivaled his graduate students. Everything he thought he knew about education, privilege, and intellectual development was suddenly in question. I don't know, Marcus admitted, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. He had built his career on certainty, on being the expert who had all the answers. Admitting ignorance felt like stepping off a cliff. But something was happening in that cramped community center room, something that would change the trajectory of multiple lives. Marcus was experiencing the first crack in a worldview that had defined his professional and personal identity for decades. And Ethan Martinez, without meaning to, had just begun the process of teaching a teacher what education really meant. The other students sensed the shift in energy, the way the power dynamic in the room had fundamentally changed. They were witnessing something rare and precious, the moment when assumption meets reality, when prejudice encounters truth, when privilege is forced to confront its own limitations. But this was only the beginning. Because Ethan Martinez had more than just mathematical ability hidden beneath his quiet exterior. And Marcus Hoffman was about to discover that his understanding of intelligence, education, and human potential was even more limited than he could have imagined. 3 days after the incident at the community center, Marcus Hoffman found himself standing outside the Central Public Library at 7 in the morning, something he had never done in his entire academic career. The building wouldn't open for another 2 hours, but he couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on his university lectures, couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. For 72 hours, the image of Ethan Martinez solving advanced calculus with quiet confidence had haunted every moment of his waking life. Marcus had spent his career in ivory towers, surrounded by students whose parents paid $50,000 a year for the privilege of learning from professors like him. He had published papers in prestigious journals, spoken at international conferences, and built his reputation on the assumption that mathematical excellence was cultivated in elite institutions with extensive resources. But a homeless 14-year-old had shattered that worldview in less than 10 minutes. As he waited for the library to open, Marcus noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the street. Ethan was walking slowly, carrying that same threadbare backpack, but there was something different about his posture this morning. The boy seemed more tired than usual, and Marcus realized with a sinking feeling that Ethan had probably spent the night in a car again, trying to stay warm while studying by streetlight. "Professor Hoffman?" Ethan's voice was surprised, but not unfriendly. "What are you doing here so early?" Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks as he realized how foolish he must look. A university professor lurking outside a public library like some kind of academic stalker. I needed to understand something. About what you said the other day." Ethan studied the older man's face with those unnervingly mature eyes. "About talent existing everywhere but opportunity not being equally distributed?" "Yes, that. And about how you learned what you've learned. I keep thinking there must be some explanation that makes sense within my understanding of how education works." A small smile played at the corners of Ethan's mouth, not mocking but genuinely amused. "You mean you're trying to figure out how someone like me could know something that someone like you thinks I shouldn't know?" The directness of the question was like a gentle slap. Marcus nodded reluctantly. "I suppose that's exactly what I'm trying to understand." When the library doors opened, Ethan led Marcus through a maze of sections to a corner that the professor had never noticed during his occasional visits to check out recreational reading. It was the mathematics and science section, but not the area where current textbooks were shelved. This was where the library kept older academic texts, dense volumes that most casual readers avoided. "This is where I spend most of my time," Ethan explained, gesturing to a worn table that was clearly his regular spot. The surface was marked with pencil indentations from countless hours of note-taking, and there was a small stack of advanced mathematics books already waiting, apparently reserved from his previous visit. Marcus picked up one of the books and nearly dropped it in shock. It was a graduate-level text on abstract algebra, the kind of material he used in his advanced undergraduate courses. The pages were filled with pencil marks, careful annotations, and worked-out problems in handwriting he recognized as Ethan's. "You've been working through this entire book?" Marcus asked, flipping through pages of complex group theory and ring structures. "Twice, actually. The first time I got about 60% of it. The second time I understood maybe 85%. I'm planning a third pass next month. Ethan said this as casually as another teenager might discuss rewatching a favorite movie. Marcus felt his knees go weak. Abstract algebra was notoriously difficult even for mathematically gifted university students with professors to guide them. The idea that a 14-year-old was self-studying this material and achieving deep understanding was beyond anything in his educational experience. But how do you know if you're understanding it correctly? How do you check your work without an instructor? Ethan pulled out a laptop that was clearly several years old and had been repaired multiple times with electrical tape. Online mathematics forums. There are graduate students and professors from universities around the world who discuss these problems. When I get stuck, I post questions. When others get stuck, I try to help if I can. You help graduate students with their mathematics problems. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. Sometimes. They don't know I'm 14, obviously. Online, everyone is just a mind working through problems together. Age and background don't matter when you're discussing whether a particular group is cyclic or trying to prove that a specific ring has unique factorization. Marcus sank into the chair across from Ethan, feeling like his entire understanding of education was crumbling around him. This boy wasn't just learning advanced mathematics. He was contributing to mathematical discussions at a graduate level, helping university students who were paying enormous tuition fees for knowledge that he was acquiring for free in a public library. Ethan, Marcus said slowly, what do you want to do with all this knowledge? What's your goal? The question seemed to surprise the boy, as if no adult had ever asked him about his aspirations before. He was quiet for a long moment, organizing his thoughts with the same careful precision he applied to mathematical proofs. I want to understand how the universe works, Ethan said finally. Mathematics is the language that describes physical reality. Everything from quantum mechanics to general relativity, from population dynamics to economic modeling, it all comes back to mathematical relationships. When you don't have money for college, when you don't have connections or opportunities, knowledge becomes your only real wealth. The profound simplicity of that statement hit Marcus like a lightning bolt. Here was a kid who understood something that most of his privileged university students never grasped, that education wasn't a commodity to be purchased, but a tool for understanding existence itself. But surely you want to attend university eventually. With your abilities, you could get scholarships, financial aid. Ethan's expression darkened slightly. Professor, do you know what happens to homeless kids who interact with official institutions? They get placed in foster care. My sister and I get separated. The social workers mean well, but the system isn't designed for kids like us who are actually doing okay on our own. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the impossible choice this brilliant boy was facing. Pursuing formal education meant risking family separation and institutional control. Remaining hidden meant limiting his access to advanced learning opportunities. Besides, Ethan continued, I'm not sure traditional universities would know what to do with someone like me. I don't learn in the standard way. I don't need lectures or assignments or grades. I need access to knowledge and the freedom to pursue understanding wherever it leads. As they talked, Marcus watched Ethan work through problems from a topology textbook that was typically used in first-year graduate courses. The boy's approach was unconventional but brilliant, often finding elegant solutions that Marcus himself would have struggled to discover. It became clear that Ethan hadn't just memorized mathematical techniques. He had developed genuine mathematical intuition. Can I ask you something, Professor? Ethan said during a break in their conversation. Of course. Why did you become a mathematician? What drew you to this field originally? The question caught Marcus off guard because it forced him to remember motivations that had been buried under decades of academic politics and career advancement. I suppose I was fascinated by the idea that mathematical truths were universal, that a theorem proven here would be true anywhere in the universe. There was something beautiful about that certainty. Do you still feel that way? Marcus was quiet for a long time, realizing that he couldn't remember the last time he had felt genuine excitement about a mathematical discovery. When had teaching become about maintaining his reputation rather than sharing wonder? When had research become about publication counts rather than understanding? I think I've lost that somewhere along the way, Marcus admitted quietly. Ethan nodded with understanding that seemed far too mature for his years. That's why I love learning this way. Every new concept I master, every problem I solve, every connection I make between different areas of mathematics, it all feels like discovering treasure. No one can take that away from me, and no one can diminish its value by grading it or ranking it. In that moment, Marcus realized that this homeless teenager possessed something precious that he himself had lost: pure love of learning for its own sake. Ethan wasn't studying mathematics to impress anyone, to earn credentials, or to advance his career. He was pursuing knowledge because understanding the universe was its own reward. And Marcus Hoffman, despite all his degrees and accolades, had forgotten what that felt like. 1 week later, Marcus Hoffman stood outside the imposing glass doors of Riverside University's mathematics department, his heart pounding with an anxiety he hadn't felt since his own graduate school days. In his briefcase was a folder containing photocopies of Ethan's handwritten solutions to advanced mathematical problems, work that had kept him awake for 7 consecutive nights as he tried to process what he was seeing. Today, he was about to do something that could either validate his growing belief that he had discovered extraordinary talent or destroy his professional reputation entirely. The department's weekly faculty meeting was already in session when Marcus entered the mahogany-paneled conference room, where his colleagues sat around an antique table that had witnessed decades of academic discourse. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the department head, looked up with mild annoyance at his tardiness. Punctuality was one of the unspoken rules that governed their insular academic world. "Marcus, please take your seat. We were just discussing the disappointing performance of students in the advanced calculus sequence. Professor Williams was explaining how enrollment continues to decline despite lowering admission standards." Professor Williams, a man in his 60s who had been teaching the same courses for 30 years, nodded gravely. "It's exactly what I've been saying for years. Today's students simply lack the intellectual rigor of previous generations. They want everything handed to them without putting in the necessary effort." Marcus felt a familiar churning in his stomach as he listened to his colleagues discuss student deficiencies with the casual dismissiveness that had once felt natural to him. Just weeks ago, he would have nodded along, perhaps even contributed his own observations about declining academic standards. But now, having witnessed Ethan's capabilities, their words felt like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the comfortable rhythm of complaint, "I'd like to share something that might challenge that perspective." The room fell silent. Marcus was known for his sharp wit and cutting observations about student inadequacies, not for defending them. Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by this unexpected turn. Marcus opened his briefcase and distributed copies of Ethan's work to his colleagues. "I want you to look at these solutions and tell me what you think about the mathematical reasoning demonstrated here." The professors began examining the papers with the critical eye of academics accustomed to finding flaws in student work. But, as they studied Ethan's elegant solutions to complex problems involving differential equations, abstract algebra, and real analysis, their expressions gradually changed from skepticism to confusion to something approaching awe. "These are quite sophisticated, Dr." Chen admitted reluctantly. "The approach to this topology problem is particularly creative. Which of your graduate students produced this work?" "That's just it," Marcus said, feeling his pulse quicken. "This wasn't written by a graduate student. It wasn't even written by an undergraduate." "Then who?" demanded Professor Williams, clearly frustrated by the intellectual puzzle. "A 14-year-old boy who has been teaching himself advanced mathematics in the public library. A homeless kid who has never taken a formal mathematics course beyond basic algebra." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls. His colleagues stared at him as if he had just announced that he believed in mathematical unicorns or had discovered a proof that 2 + 2 = 5. "That's impossible," Professor Williams said flatly. "No 14-year-old, regardless of natural ability, could produce work at this level without years of formal instruction and guidance." "I thought the same thing," Marcus replied. "That's why I spent the last week testing him. I gave him problems from our most challenging graduate courses. He solved them all, not just correctly, but with insights that even impressed me." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression skeptical but intrigued. "Marcus, you're asking us to believe that a homeless child has somehow achieved mathematical sophistication that rivals our doctoral candidates. Do you understand how that sounds?" "I understand exactly how it sounds because I felt the same disbelief. But the evidence is right there in front of you." Look at the work itself, not your assumptions about who could have produced it. Professor Williams stood up abruptly, his face flushed with indignation. This is ridiculous, Marcus. You're either being deceived by some elaborate hoax, or you've lost all academic judgment. Homeless children don't spontaneously develop expertise in abstract algebra and differential topology. Why not? Marcus asked quietly. Because they don't have access to expensive schools? Because their parents can't afford private tutors? Because society has written them off as intellectually inferior? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the faculty had spent their careers believing about intelligence, education, and academic achievement. Marcus could see his colleagues struggling with the cognitive dissonance of evidence that contradicted their fundamental assumptions. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, the youngest faculty member and the only one who seemed genuinely intrigued rather than defensive, spoke up. If this is real, Marcus, then we need to help this boy. Someone with that kind of talent shouldn't be wasting away without proper educational opportunities. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Marcus replied, pulling out a second folder. Because I have a proposal that I think could benefit everyone involved. For the next hour, Marcus outlined an unprecedented plan. He wanted the university to create a special arrangement, allowing Ethan to audit advanced mathematics courses without formal enrollment. The boy would have access to lectures, professors, and resources, but wouldn't be subject to the institutional requirements that might trigger unwanted attention from social services. It's highly irregular, Dr. Chen pointed out. Insurance liability, administrative complications, questions from the Board of Trustees. All solvable problems, Marcus insisted. What's not solvable is wasting extraordinary intellectual potential because we're too bureaucratic to think creatively. Professor Williams remained adamantly opposed. Even if this boy is as gifted as you claim, bringing him here sets a dangerous precedent. What happens when every parent in the city starts demanding special accommodations for their supposedly brilliant children? Then we evaluate each case individually, based on demonstrated ability rather than demographic assumptions, Marcus replied with growing conviction. Isn't that what academic institutions should be doing? The debate continued for another hour, with Marcus finding himself defending not just Ethan's capabilities, but challenging the entire framework of how academic excellence was recognized and nurtured. He realized that he wasn't just advocating for one exceptional student. He was questioning whether elite universities were serving their fundamental purpose of advancing human knowledge and understanding. Finally, Dr. Chen called for a vote. The result was narrow, 4 in favor, 3 opposed. But it was enough to authorize a probationary program that would allow Ethan to attend lectures on a trial basis. As his colleagues filed out of the conference room, many shaking their heads and muttering about declining academic standards, Dr. Rodriguez approached Marcus with obvious excitement. "I want to meet this boy," she said. "If even half of what you've told us is true, he could revolutionize how we think about mathematical education and talent development." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time since discovering Ethan's abilities, he felt like he had found an ally who understood the profound implications of what they were witnessing. "There's something else you should know," Marcus said quietly. "This boy isn't just mathematically gifted. He has a perspective on learning and knowledge that's completely transformed how I think about teaching. He's reminded me why I became a mathematician in the first place." Dr. Rodriguez studied Marcus's face with curiosity. "You seem different, Marcus. More passionate than I've seen you in the years we've worked together." "That's because I've remembered something I forgot somewhere along the way," Marcus replied. "That the purpose of education isn't to confirm existing hierarchies or validate our assumptions about who deserves opportunities. It's to unleash human potential wherever we find it." As Marcus left the university that evening, he realized that bringing Ethan into the academic world would change more than just the boy's life. It would force everyone involved to confront their deepest beliefs about intelligence, merit, and the true purpose of higher education. The transformation was accelerating, and there would be no going back. Chapter 05. 2 weeks later, Ethan Martinez walked through the grand entrance of Riverside University for the first time in his life, his worn backpack looking starkly out of place among the designer bags and expensive laptops that surrounded him. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and everything about the environment screamed wealth and privilege. From the students' casual conversations about spring break trips to Europe to their effortless confidence that they belonged in these hallowed halls. Marcus waited nervously by the information desk, checking his watch for the third time in 2 minutes. He had spent sleepless nights wondering if he was making a terrible mistake. Bringing a homeless teenager into this elite academic environment felt like introducing a wild animal into a carefully manicured zoo. Not because Ethan lacked intelligence, but because the university ecosystem was designed to exclude people exactly like him. When Ethan appeared, Marcus felt a mix of pride and protective anxiety. The boy had clearly made an effort to look presentable, but his clothes still bore the telltale signs of someone living without consistent access to laundry facilities. Several students glanced at him with undisguised curiosity, their expressions ranging from puzzled to mildly disdainful. "Ready for your first university experience?" Marcus asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I've been ready for this my whole life," Ethan replied with quiet determination. "The question is whether the university is ready for me." They walked across campus toward the mathematics building, Marcus pointing out various landmarks while internally rehearsing how he would introduce Ethan to his colleagues and students. He had scheduled the boy to audit his most advanced undergraduate course, topics in abstract algebra, figuring it would provide an appropriate level of challenge without throwing him directly into graduate-level material. As they entered the lecture hall, Marcus noticed the immediate reaction of his students. 23 carefully groomed young adults from prestigious prep schools and wealthy families suddenly found themselves staring at a 14-year-old who looked like he had wandered in from a completely different world. The whispers started immediately. "Is that kid lost?" someone muttered near the back. "Maybe he's the professor's son," another student speculated. Marcus felt his protective instincts flaring, but Ethan seemed completely unbothered by the attention. He found an empty seat in the middle of the room and quietly pulled out a notebook that had clearly seen extensive use, its cover held together with tape and filled with careful mathematical notations. "Before we begin today's lecture," Marcus announced to the class, "I want to introduce someone who will be auditing our course. This is Ethan Martinez, and I think you'll find his perspective on mathematics quite illuminating." The introduction was deliberately vague, but Marcus could see the confusion in his students' faces. They were accustomed to a certain type of person in advanced mathematics courses, typically older students who had progressed through the traditional academic pipeline. Ethan's presence disrupted their expectations in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. As Marcus began the day's lecture on Galois theory, he found himself watching Ethan out of the corner of his eye. The boy was taking notes with intense concentration, occasionally nodding when Marcus explained particularly complex concepts. But what struck Marcus most was how naturally Ethan seemed to follow the material. There was no struggling to keep up, no confused expressions that typically characterized students encountering these ideas for the first time. About halfway through the lecture, Marcus decided to take a risk. "Can anyone explain why this particular field extension is significant in the context of solving polynomial equations?" The usual suspects raised their hands. Jennifer Chen, whose parents had paid for private mathematics tutoring since elementary school, and David Richardson, whose father was a research mathematician at MIT. Both gave competent but textbook answers that demonstrated understanding without showing real insight. Then Ethan's hand went up. The classroom fell silent. Even students who hadn't been paying attention suddenly focused on this unexpected participant in their academic ritual. "Yes, Ethan," Marcus said, his heart racing with anticipation and anxiety. Ethan stood up, and Marcus realized that this was the first time any of his university students had seen the boy speak. "The field extension is significant because it reveals the deep connection between algebraic structures and geometric transformations. When Galois showed that certain polynomial equations couldn't be solved by radicals, he wasn't just proving a negative result. He was demonstrating that the symmetries of mathematical objects impose fundamental limitations on the methods we can use to understand them." The room was dead silent. Ethan's explanation went far beyond the standard textbook answer, connecting abstract algebra to broader philosophical questions about the nature of mathematical knowledge. Several students exchanged glances, clearly struggling to process what they had just heard from someone who looked like their younger brother. "That's exactly right," Marcus said, unable to hide his amazement. And can you elaborate on the implications of that insight? Well, Ethan continued, warming to the subject, it suggests that some mathematical problems can't be solved by brute force or clever tricks. You have to understand the underlying structure deeply enough to recognize when you're asking an impossible question. It's like trying to build a bridge without understanding the laws of physics. You might get close, but you'll never achieve what you're actually trying to accomplish. Jennifer Chen, who had been class valedictorian at one of the most prestigious prep schools in the country, raised her hand with obvious frustration. I'm sorry, but who exactly are you? How old are you? What's your educational background? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt the dynamic in the room shift towards something potentially explosive. This was the moment he had been dreading, when privilege would confront talent directly and demand explanations that threatened comfortable assumptions about merit and opportunity. Ethan looked at Jennifer with calm eyes that seemed much older than his 14 years. I'm exactly who Professor Hoffman introduced me as. My educational background is everything I've been able to learn on my own, because that's all that's been available to me. As for my age, I don't think mathematical truth depends on the birth date of the person expressing it. But that's impossible, David Richardson interjected, his voice carrying the entitled indignation of someone whose worldview was being challenged. You can't just walk into a university-level mathematics course without proper preparation. There are prerequisites, there are standards. Standards like being able to afford $50,000 a year in tuition, Ethan asked quietly. Standards like having parents who can hire private tutors and test preparation coaches? Or standards like actually understanding the material well enough to contribute meaningfully to the discussion? The question cut through the room like a knife. Marcus watched his privileged students grapple with the uncomfortable reality that their educational advantages might not translate into intellectual superiority. They had spent their lives believing that their elite backgrounds made them inherently more capable, more deserving of academic opportunities. This is ridiculous, Jennifer said, her voice rising with anger. Professor Hoffman, I don't understand why we're being forced to listen to some kid who probably doesn't even have a high school diploma lecture us about advanced mathematics. But before Marcus could respond, something unexpected happened. Sarah Kim, a quiet student who rarely spoke in class, raised her hand tentatively. Actually, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, I think what he said about Galois theory made more sense than anything in our textbook. I've been struggling with this material all semester, but the way he explained it, I finally understand why we're studying it. Her admission created a ripple effect through the classroom. Other students began to nod, reluctantly acknowledging that Ethan's explanation had been clearer and more insightful than their expensive textbooks or private tutoring sessions. Marcus felt something shifting in the room, a crack in the facade of academic entitlement that had characterized his classes for years. For the first time, his students were being forced to evaluate ideas based on their merit rather than the credentials of the person expressing them. Perhaps, Marcus said carefully, this is an opportunity for all of us to learn something important about the nature of intelligence and education. Ethan, would you be willing to work through the next problem on the board? As Ethan walked to the front of the classroom, Marcus realized that this moment would change more than just one lecture. It would force everyone present to confront their assumptions about who deserved to be in elite academic spaces and why. The transformation was no longer limited to Marcus's personal journey. It was spreading to his students, his institution, and everyone who witnessed what happened when talent met opportunity, regardless of background or circumstance. The mathematics department at Riverside University had never experienced anything like the disruption that followed Ethan Martinez's first week of classes. Word spread through the campus with the speed of wildfire. A homeless teenager was not only auditing advanced mathematics courses, but was outperforming students who had paid astronomical tuition fees and had every educational advantage money could buy. Dr. Elizabeth Chen found herself fielding angry phone calls from parents who couldn't understand why their children were suddenly questioning the value of their expensive education. Board members demanded explanations for why university resources were being used for someone who wasn't paying tuition. And perhaps most disturbing of all, several faculty members were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the entire structure of higher education. Marcus stood in his office, staring out at the manicured campus grounds while listening to the latest complaint from Dr. Chen. Through his window, he could see Ethan sitting under an oak tree, surrounded by a small group of students who had started seeking him out for help with their coursework. The sight filled Marcus with a complex mixture of pride, anxiety, and something approaching awe. "Marcus, we need to talk," Dr. Chen said as she entered his office without knocking, her expression grim. "The situation with your protege is spiraling out of control. What exactly is the problem, Elizabeth? Last time I checked, exceptional students performing at high levels was supposed to be what universities celebrate. The problem is that he's making our paying students look incompetent by comparison." Jennifer Chen's father called this morning. Apparently his daughter is having what he called an academic crisis because a homeless child is explaining mathematical concepts better than her professors. David Richardson's parents are threatening to transfer him to Princeton if we don't address what they're calling this disruption to proper academic standards. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, but it wasn't directed at Ethan or even at the complaining parents. It was directed at a system that had become so obsessed with protecting privilege that it viewed genuine excellence as a threat. "So we're supposed to suppress extraordinary talent because it makes mediocre privileged students uncomfortable?" Marcus asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "We're supposed to maintain an environment where our tuition-paying students can succeed without being humiliated by someone who shouldn't technically be here in the first place. Shouldn't be here according to whom? According to admissions requirements based on family income, rather than intellectual ability. According to a system that assumes intelligence is distributed based on zip code." Dr. Chen sat down heavily in the chair across from Marcus's desk, suddenly looking older than her 58 years. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. I've been in academic administration for 25 years. I've seen brilliant students from disadvantaged backgrounds before, but I've never seen anything like what you've brought into this institution." "What do you mean?" "Ethan isn't just academically gifted. He's fundamentally changing how our students and faculty think about education itself. Dr. Rodriguez told me that 3 students approached her after Ethan's explanation of topology concepts, asking why they were paying for lectures when they could learn more effectively from someone who taught himself." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implications of what Dr. Chen was saying. Ethan's presence wasn't just challenging academic assumptions, it was threatening the entire economic model of elite higher education. "Yesterday," Dr. Chen continued, "Professor Williams found 2 of his graduate students in the library working through problems with Ethan. When he asked them what they were doing, they told him that this 14-year-old had helped them understand research concepts that Williams had been unable to explain clearly. And that's a bad thing? It's a catastrophic thing if our graduate students start believing they can get better education for free in the public library than they can get from our faculty." "Marcus, do you understand what you've unleashed here?" Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Dr. Rodriguez entered, her face flushed with excitement, and carrying a stack of papers that she set down on Marcus's desk with obvious enthusiasm. "You need to see this," she said breathlessly. "Ethan just solved a research problem that I've been working on for 8 months. Not only did he solve it, but his approach is so elegant that I think it could lead to a breakthrough in algebraic geometry." Dr. Chen stared at the papers as if they were evidence of some impossible crime. "A research problem. Sarah, are you telling me that this child is now contributing to original mathematical research?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And Elizabeth, it gets better. I showed his solution to colleagues at MIT and Stanford. They want to know who this mysterious mathematician is because his work is at the level of a postdoctoral researcher." Marcus felt the room spinning around him as he realized that Ethan's abilities extended far beyond even what he had imagined. This wasn't just a gifted student who could handle advanced coursework. This was someone who was pushing the boundaries of mathematical knowledge itself. "We can't let this information get out," Dr. Chen said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "If word spreads that a homeless teenager is outperforming our faculty in original research, it will destroy the credibility of our entire institution. Or, Dr. Rodriguez countered with growing conviction, it will force us to completely rethink what academic institutions are supposed to be doing. Maybe the real question isn't how to protect our existing system, but whether our existing system is worth protecting." The philosophical challenge hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Marcus realized that they had reached a crossroads that would define not just Ethan's future, but the future of how society understood education, intelligence, and opportunity. There's something else, Dr. Rodriguez continued, pulling out her phone. Ethan's story is starting to go viral on social media. Students have been posting videos of his explanations, sharing his insights. We're getting emails from professors at universities around the world asking about this mystery mathematician who's revolutionizing how people think about learning. Dr. Chen put her head in her hands. This is exactly what I was afraid of. We're losing control of the narrative. Maybe that's not a bad thing, Marcus said quietly. Maybe it's time for the narrative to change. As if summoned by their conversation, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression serious, but not apologetic. Professor Hoffman, Dr. Chen, Dr. Rodriguez, I think we need to talk. Ethan, Dr. Chen said with forced politeness, we were just discussing your situation. I know what you were discussing, Ethan replied with that unnervingly mature directness. Word travels fast on a college campus, especially when people are arguing about whether someone like me should exist in a place like this. He stepped into the office, and Marcus was struck again by the quiet dignity that this boy carried despite his circumstances. There was no anger in his demeanor, no defensiveness, just the calm confidence of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Dr. Chen, Ethan said, addressing the department head directly, I want you to know that I never intended to disrupt your institution or make anyone uncomfortable. I just wanted access to knowledge and the opportunity to learn alongside other people who love mathematics. Ethan, it's not that simple, Dr. Chen began, but he raised his hand gently. Please, let me finish. I've been thinking about this situation and I understand the position I've put everyone in. I represent something that challenges fundamental assumptions about how intelligence is developed and distributed. My very existence here forces uncomfortable questions about fairness, merit, and who deserves access to educational opportunities. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to this remarkable young man articulate the institutional crisis that none of the adults had been able to express clearly. But I also want you to consider something, Ethan continued. Maybe the discomfort people are feeling isn't because I don't belong here. Maybe it's because they're realizing that the current system of education has been leaving behind thousands of people just like me. Maybe the crisis isn't that I'm here, but that it took this long for someone like me to get here. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, completely captivated. What are you suggesting, Ethan? I'm suggesting that instead of trying to protect a system that depends on exclusion, maybe we should build one that actively seeks out talent wherever it exists. Instead of defending privilege, maybe we should be expanding opportunity. Instead of worrying about disruption, maybe we should be celebrating transformation. The room fell silent as the three professors absorbed the profound simplicity of Ethan's vision. Here was a 14-year-old homeless child proposing a fundamental reimagining of higher education, not from theory or ideology, but from lived experience of what learning could be when it was divorced from economic barriers. And if the current system can't handle that kind of change? Dr. Chen asked quietly. Ethan smiled with a wisdom that seemed impossible for his age. Then maybe it's time for a new system, one that measures success by how much human potential it unleashes, not by how much exclusivity it maintains. In that moment, Marcus realized that they weren't just witnessing the education of a remarkable student. They were witnessing the birth of an educational revolution that would challenge everything they thought they knew about intelligence, opportunity, and the purpose of learning itself. The transformation was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control it. And Ethan Martinez, with his quiet brilliance and unshakable integrity, was leading them all toward a future that none of them could have imagined. 1 year later, the grand auditorium of the International Conference on Educational Innovation buzzed with anticipation as nearly 2,000 educators, researchers, and policymakers from around the world gathered to witness something unprecedented in academic history. The keynote presentation was titled Reimagining Human Potential When Talent Meets Opportunity, and it was being delivered by the most unlikely pair of speakers anyone could imagine. Dr. Marcus Hoffman, now known as one of the most revolutionary voices in educational reform, and Ethan Martinez, the 15-year-old who had become the youngest person ever invited to address the global education community. Marcus stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces that represented the future of learning worldwide. His transformation over the past year had been as remarkable as any academic discovery he had ever made. Gone was the arrogant professor who had once dismissed students based on their backgrounds. In his place stood a man who had rediscovered his passion for education and had become a fierce advocate for democratizing access to knowledge. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the hushed auditorium, 15 months ago, I was everything that was wrong with modern education. I believed that intelligence was a privilege of the wealthy, that academic excellence could only emerge from elite institutions, and that my role as an educator was to guard knowledge rather than share it freely. He paused, allowing the weight of his confession to settle over the audience. Then I met a 14-year-old homeless boy who taught me the most important lesson of my career, that genius exists everywhere, but opportunity does not. Today, I want to share with you the story of how one extraordinary young man didn't just change my life. He changed the entire way we think about human potential. Marcus gestured toward the side of the stage, and Ethan walked out to thunderous applause. The boy had grown taller over the past year, and while his clothes were still modest, there was a confidence in his bearing that spoke to someone who had finally found his place in the world. Most remarkably, he was no longer homeless. A scholarship fund established in his name had provided not just educational opportunities, but stable housing for him and his sister. Before I tell you about the incredible journey that brought us here, Marcus continued, I want Ethan to share something that will demonstrate why this conversation matters so much. Ethan approached the microphone with the same quiet dignity that had characterized their first meeting, but now it was amplified by the knowledge that his story had already begun changing lives around the world. Thank you, Professor Hoffman, Ethan said, his voice clear and strong. A year ago, I was a homeless kid whose greatest dream was simply to have access to advanced mathematics textbooks. I never imagined that my story would inspire educational reforms in 12 countries, or that major universities would begin actively recruiting talented students from underserved communities. The audience leaned forward, captivated by the poise and wisdom of this remarkable teenager. But the most important thing I've learned this year isn't about mathematics or academic achievement. It's about the responsibility that comes with privilege, and how true education happens when we choose to lift others up rather than use our advantages to separate ourselves from them. Ethan clicked to the first slide of their presentation, which showed before and after statistics that took everyone's breath away. In the year since his story had gone viral, over 300 universities worldwide had implemented opportunity programs designed to identify and nurture talent regardless of economic background. More than 10,000 students who would never have had access to higher education were now enrolled in these programs. These numbers represent more than educational statistics, Ethan explained. They represent human beings whose potential was being wasted because society had written them off based on circumstances beyond their control. They represent the Marcus Hoffmans of tomorrow. Not just brilliant students, but brilliant teachers who will continue this cycle of opportunity. The presentation continued with Marcus sharing the practical details of how Riverside University had completely transformed its approach to education. Traditional admission requirements had been supplemented with potential assessment programs that evaluated students based on their capacity for growth rather than their accumulated advantages. The results had been extraordinary. Not only were these students performing at the same level as their traditionally admitted peers, but they were often exceeding expectations because of their hunger for learning and their deep appreciation for the opportunities they'd been given. The most remarkable discovery, Marcus explained, is that when you create educational environments focused on nurturing potential rather than confirming privilege, everyone benefits. Our traditional students are performing better because they're being challenged by peers who bring different perspectives and unwavering determination. Our faculty are rediscovering their passion for teaching because they're working with students who genuinely want to learn. Dr. Rodriguez, who had become the director of the university's new Center for Educational Equity, joined them on stage to share research findings that were revolutionizing academic understanding of intelligence and achievement. Studies of the Opportunity Program students had revealed that socioeconomic background had virtually no correlation with ultimate academic success when students were given adequate support and resources. What we've learned, Dr. Rodriguez explained, is that intelligence is indeed distributed equally across all populations, but opportunity has been artificially concentrated among the wealthy. When we correct for that imbalance, we discover reservoirs of human potential that have been ignored for generations. But perhaps the most powerful moment of the presentation came when Ethan shared updates from students whose lives had been changed by the programs inspired by his story. There was Maria Santos, a former homeless teenager from Mexico City who was now studying astrophysics at one of Europe's top universities. There was David Kim, a refugee from North Korea who had become a leading researcher in artificial intelligence. There was Sarah Williams, a girl from rural Mississippi whose mathematical insights were already contributing to breakthrough research in quantum computing. Each of these students represents not just individual success, but exponential impact, Ethan explained. Because they understand what it means to be overlooked and underestimated, they're committed to ensuring that the next generation has even better opportunities. They're becoming teachers, researchers, policymakers who will continue expanding access to education for decades to come. As the presentation neared its conclusion, Marcus took the microphone for one final reflection on his personal transformation. "I want to be completely honest with all of you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "For most of my career, I was part of the problem. I used my position and privilege to exclude rather than include, to confirm existing hierarchies rather than challenge them. I told myself I was maintaining standards, but I was really just protecting a system that benefited people like me at the expense of people like Ethan." He looked directly at the boy who had become not just his student, but his teacher and inspiration. Ethan didn't just show me that I was wrong about intelligence and education. He showed me what I could become if I had the courage to change. Today, I'm a better teacher, a better researcher, and a better human being because a homeless 14-year-old had the wisdom and patience to help me see beyond my own limitations. For the final segment of their presentation, Ethan addressed the audience directly with a challenge that would define the future of education worldwide. "Every person in this auditorium has the power to change lives," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You can choose to use your positions to protect existing privileges, or you can choose to democratize opportunity. You can continue systems that waste human potential, or you can build systems that unleash it. The choice you make will determine not just the future of education, but the future of human civilization itself. Because the next breakthrough in medicine, the next solution to climate change, the next innovation that transforms our world, it might come from a homeless teenager studying by streetlight, or a refugee learning in a library, or a girl in a rural village who dreams of understanding the universe. Don't let privilege blind you to potential. Don't let comfort prevent you from courage. And never, ever underestimate what human beings can achieve when given genuine opportunity to learn and grow." The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, but Marcus barely heard it. He was watching Ethan, marveling at how this extraordinary young man had not only transformed his own life, but had catalyzed a global movement that was reshaping education for millions of students worldwide. As they left the stage together, Marcus realized that his journey was far from over. There were still countless students like Ethan waiting for someone to recognize their potential. Still countless barriers to break down. Still countless minds to open to the infinite possibilities that existed when education truly served human flourishing, rather than social stratification. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly as they walked off stage. "For what?" Ethan asked with genuine curiosity. "For teaching me that the purpose of education isn't to prove how smart we are, but to help others discover how smart they can become. For showing me that true intelligence lies not in what we know, but in our willingness to learn, grow, and lift others up along the way." Ethan smiled with the wisdom that had first captivated Marcus in that community center so many months ago. "Professor, the best teachers are always learning, and the best students are always teaching. That's what makes education beautiful. It's not a transaction, it's a transformation that never ends." As they walked into the future together, teacher and student, mentor and inspiration, two human beings who had discovered that the greatest discoveries happen not in laboratories or lecture halls, but in the moments when we choose to see the extraordinary potential that exists in every person we meet.